In the morning, there was a man who finished taking a shower. He sat wrapped in a towel in his room. The man's name was Mason. He remembered about his past as a former soldier. He then took a photo with his friends and also his award medals. Mason remembered about his last failed mission when he attacked a Poldonian president named Venegas, who was considered cruel to his own citizens. At that time, Mason was assigned to get off the helicopter and walk through the forest. But when Mason got off the helicopter, suddenly someone shot his helicopter. This caused the helicopter that contained Mason's friends to explode, and several of them died. Although Mason survived, he felt sad about losing them. Mason also felt that his mission had failed. So, Mason decided to quit the military and become a normal citizen. He married a woman named Jenny and had a daughter named Casey. Shortly after Mason remembered his past, his wife named Jenny called Mason. Jenny told him to immediately get ready to deliver their daughter named Casey. Hearing that, Mason immediately packed up his photos and medals and changed clothes. After that, Mason hurried to meet Jenny and Casey in the kitchen. They chatted casually, and then Mason took Casey to school. On the way to school, Casey told Mason that her male friend named Chase was always approaching her and trying to kiss her. Mason was surprised to hear that because he knew Casey was only 9 years old. Mason then told Casey to fight Chase by hitting his neck. Mason didn't mean it seriously, he was just joking. But Casey took his father's words as an order. Soon Casey arrived at school and Mason continued his journey to the office. When Mason arrived at the office, there was a client who asked Mason for help. It was known that Mason was currently working as a lawyer. The man explained his problem, which made Mason a little dizzy. Shortly after his client left, a man arrived who turned out to be Mason's friend in the military. The man was Sebastian. He was a member of the military, as well as a businessman in the weapons sector. When Mason saw Sebastian coming, he who was initially gloomy turned happy. Then Sebastian invited Mason to go somewhere. With Sebastian's sports car, the two of them arrived at Sebastian's place. Sebastian immediately stated his purpose in inviting Mason to his place. He wanted to invite Mason to carry out a mission to protect a journalist. The journalist Sebastian was referring to was named Claire. She was assigned to interview the president of Poldonia, who was known to be very cruel. Sebastian chose Mason because he knew that Mason had been to Poldonia on a mission even though it failed. After hearing Sebastian's explanation, Mason didn't make an easy decision. He asked for more time to think. Sebastian gladly gave him time, and he would wait for good news from Mason. In the afternoon, Mason went to pick up Casey at her school, but Mason was surprised to see Jenny, his wife, was already at school with Casey. With an annoyed face, Jenny looked at Mason. When they arrived home, Jenny explained that Casey's teacher called her because Casey had hit her friend. Jenny said that Casey hit her friend because it was the teaching of her father, Mason. Jenny was of course angry with Mason. She thought that Mason taught bad things to his daughter. In addition, they have to pay for their friend Casey's medical expenses at the hospital and pay a fine to the school. Then Jenny was confused about how to get that much money. Mason felt guilty, so he asked his wife for permission to take the job offered by Sebastian. At first, Jenny prevented Mason, but Mason and Jenny realized that Mason could get a lot of money if he worked with Sebastian. Then Mason went straight to Sebastian's place. The next day, Mason arrived at Sebastian's place. With full confidence, Mason told Sebastian that he was ready to carry out the mission that Sebastian offered. Hearing that, Sebastian happily immediately told Mason to go see Claire. It turned out that Claire was already in front of her house. She thought Mason was her fan, considering Claire was a famous journalist. Claire then gave an autograph in Mason's book. Then Mason explained that he was Sebastian's man. Hearing that, Claire realized that Mason was the bodyguard accompanying Claire when she met Venegas later. Soon, Claire took Mason to the airport. When they arrived at the airport, they boarded a private plane that Venegas sent for the two of them to leave for Poldonia. Long story short, Claire and Mason arrived in Poldonia. Claire saw Venegas bodyguards welcoming Claire and Mason. Claire got off first and then Mason. Venegas was immediately amazed at Claire's beauty, which was more beautiful than on TV. He then kissed Claire's hand and asked for a photo with her. Seeing that, Claire was surprised, but she still had to be calm. Meanwhile, Mason was only silent when Venegas bodyguards searched Mason's luggage, including the gun that Mason put separately in his pocket. Then Venegas took them to the village where Venegas was born. They passed through densely populated neighborhoods and markets. Venegas tried to show them life in his country. Unexpectedly, when they stopped for a moment, a student mocked Venegas. Mason and Claire were shocked, but they still tried to respect Venegas as president. Not long after, they arrived at a bridge leading to the forest. Suddenly, the bodyguard car in front of them exploded. Seeing that, Mason suddenly remembered the explosion of the helicopter that carried his friends in the past. Mason was silent for a few seconds. Then he realized that Claire was in danger. Mason immediately drove the car forward, but they were surrounded by hitmen carrying bazookas. Finally, Mason chose to run him over. After that, Mason got out of the car and shot several people to death. Mason invited Claire to leave the bridge, as the situation was already conducive. Mason thought that this incident was the work of Venegas himself. Venegas was angry because he felt that he did not send the hitmen. He also said that they seemed to want to kill Venegas. Mason didn't care about Venegas' words. He then pushed Claire to leave Venegas. On their way in the forest, Mason called Sebastian for help. Mason explained that they were attacked by a group of unknown people. Sebastian was afraid that something had happened to Claire, but Mason assured him that Claire was fine. He also said that Venegas was with them. Hearing that, Sebastian was shocked because all he knew was that Venegas was a cruel person. Sebastian then planned to send a helicopter as soon as possible. Meanwhile, at the state palace, Venegas' nephew was dressed very neatly. He looked happy. He thought that Venegas had been killed in the attack, but George was surprised when he got a call. He thought it was someone who would give him good news. However, it turned out that George's assumption was wrong because the person who called him was Venegas. After telling George that Venegas was still alive, Venegas felt that his nephew was the mastermind of the coup. Mason had no idea that Venegas' nephew could be so cruel to his own uncle. A few minutes later, a helicopter arrived. They thought that it was help from Sebastian. Unfortunately, it turned out to be a mysterious mercenary. They were looking for the whereabouts of Mason, Venegas, and also Claire. Mason and Claire immediately ran away. The helicopter kept shooting at them, so Claire and Mason had to keep running to find a safe place. Mason and Claire even had to pass through a rushing river. After a while, they managed to enter the forest across the river. Mason then prepared to shoot the helicopter. Meanwhile, Claire secretly recorded the incident when Mason shot the helicopter. Until finally the helicopter almost fell, but they didn't realize. Then they immediately ran away from the helicopter. Mason and Claire realized that there were two mercenaries who managed to survive. Mason finally chose to separate from Claire. Meanwhile, Claire did not know Mason's whereabouts. Claire was almost killed by one of the mercenaries. Fortunately, Mason came and saved Claire. He also managed to kill the mercenary. Soon it turned out that the other mercenary was still alive. He then pointed a gun at Mason and Claire. He asked about Venegas' whereabouts. Venegas unexpectedly appeared and shot the soldier in the back. Mason then thanked Venegas for saving them both. Thus, Mason also finally believed that the mercenary was not Venegas' man. Then Venegas invited them to go to a village which was Venegas' hometown. On the way, they took a short break. Claire and Mason chatted and seemed to get along better. Claire was even curious if Mason was married or had ever been married. Mason also said that he was a lawyer as well as an agent at Sebastian's place. After the break, Mason, Venegas, and Claire continued their journey. Moments later, they arrived at Venegas' home village. The villagers were very familiar with Venegas. They welcomed Venegas, Mason, and Claire. Venegas also introduced his best friend and the village chief, as well as Peppino, who would give them a ride tomorrow. Then the three of them decided to take a shower in the public bathroom. But unfortunately, there were no towels in the bathroom, so the three of them had to go out without using anything. Seeing that, they laughed at each other because they both didn't wear towels. In the afternoon, Venegas asked Claire to do an interview. Claire happily agreed to do the interview, even with a phone camera and a makeshift chair. During the interview, Claire asked why Venegas was known as a cruel man to his people. Venegas firmly said that it was just a slander of officials and a hoax, because Venegas was actually not like that. This could be proven by the villagers who loved and respected Venegas. Then Venegas explained that the country he led was a country that had materials, such as metals and rare materials, that made other countries want to have them. Therefore, Venegas was very firm, because he wanted to protect what Poldonia had. He would not let other countries destroy Poldonia. In fact, he really wanted the resources to be managed by his citizens so that they could prosper as a whole. Hearing that, Mason and Claire were even more convinced that Venegas was a good and wise man. All the villagers who heard the conversation immediately cheered and supported Venegas. Later that evening, Mason, Claire, and Venegas went to a party in the village. They had fun and enjoyed the party, until finally Mason and Claire got to sleep in the same house. Claire saw Mason, who was about to sleep in a chair. Then Claire teased Mason. With a seductive stare, Claire invited Mason to play a game so that they knew who would sleep in the bed. But Mason refused Claire's invitation because he still loved Jenny. Then they decided to sleep. The next morning, Mason told Claire that they were going to Puerto Rico. But moments later, Venegas arrived. Venegas asks why Mason sent Sebastian with Claire and why Sebastian sent Mason to Poldonia. The questions made Mason realize that he didn't know the reason why Sebastian chose him. Then he called Sebastian and asked why he sent him. Then Sebastian said that George wanted Mason to kill Venegas. This could be revenge because Venegas had killed Mason's fellow soldiers in the past, but it seemed that Venegas' brother felt that Venegas knew his plan. So he staged a coup by sending mercenary soldiers who attacked Mason on the bridge. Hearing that, Mason felt upset because he was in a difficult situation. Then Mason called Jenny and said that he was grateful to Jenny for accompanying him continuously. He also expressed his affection, which made Jenny afraid that Mason would not return home safely. He promised that he would come home. After that, Mason decided to take Claire away from the village. Not long after, mercenaries came to the village. Mason, Claire, and Venegas immediately hid, but when the village chief was beaten by them, Venegas approached them. He wanted to hand himself in, but Mason wouldn't allow that. He rode a horse and picked Venegas up. At first he refused because he was afraid of horses. However, Mason pushed him to get on, and they ran away from the village along with Claire, who also rode a horse. Unfortunately, on the way, Claire fell, and they caught her. Mason and Venegas continued their journey. Venegas told Mason that a group of American soldiers were shot down by African mercenaries. Mason realized that the helicopter Venegas told him about was the helicopter Mason and his friend were on. He also found out that it wasn't Venegas who attacked him, but the African mercenaries. Mason felt guilty because he thought Venegas was evil and cruel. After that, Venegas said that he was willing to exchange himself to save Claire. But before that, as night fell, they stopped at a church. Venegas borrowed Mason's satellite phone to call his friend Eduardo. In the morning, he asked Eduardo to help him set up an exchange plan between Venegas and Claire. Eduardo gladly agreed to help Venegas. Until a few hours later, Mason went to a field in the center of the settlement. Shortly afterward, African mercenaries arrived with Claire. The leader of the soldiers was upset that Venegas was not with Mason. There was almost a shootout between Mason and them, but Mason immediately called Venegas, who casually walked from behind. There were many citizens who came and made the situation crowded, so that the mercenaries could not shoot because there were many people. This became a good opportunity for Mason and Claire to escape. Then they managed to escape among the crowd. Venegas took Mason and Claire to the state palace. He wanted to do a live broadcast and clarification for the whole world to know. They went through a secret tunnel that led directly to the state palace. On the other side, George sat in Venegas' chair. He thought that Venegas was dead. Moments later, George was surprised to see Venegas coming from behind a wall of paintings. He didn't know that it was a secret way that only Venegas knew about. Mason quickly pointed a gun at George, but then General Martinez suddenly shot Venegas. Mason was worried if Venegas was injured, but it turned out that Venegas was fine because he was wearing a bulletproof suit. Then the soldiers entered and thought Venegas had killed George. However, Venegas managed to convince them that he did nothing wrong. Moments later, the African mercenaries arrived and attacked Mason, Venegas, and Claire. Fortunately, they managed to get into the secret room. When they came out, the mercenaries were still trying to shoot them. Mason decided to protect Venegas and Claire, but he had to deal with the leader of the mercenaries named Colonel Joe. Mason fought with him for a while, and both of them were injured as they fell down the stairs multiple times. This left the back injured Mason in pain. Colonel Joe tried to kill him, but luckily Claire arrived in time. She hit Colonel Joe's neck and saved Mason. After a few moments of rest, Mason took the weapons belonging to the soldiers of the state palace and fired at the mercenaries. Not long after that, Sebastian came and helped the three of them. Seeing that, Mason was very relieved. Then the live broadcast recorded by Claire became trending news. The whole world discussed the incident at the state palace. This made the world realize that Venegas was not a cruel president, but he was slandered by greedy people. After the situation was settled, Venegas held a press conference the next day and announced that he was resigning from the presidency. The news was also broadcast on television. Even Jenny, Mason's wife, accidentally saw the news where Mason was standing next to Venegas. She was very proud and also happy that her husband survived. The next day, Mason arrived in front of his house. Jenny and Casey welcomed him happily. Jenny wouldn't divorce Mason either because she loved him so much. Then Mason received good news because Sebastian sent Mason's salary, so Mason didn't worry about his finances.